Tape's rolling. A 1, a 2, a 1.
Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills.
We are continuing on with our series through, not really through the Gospel of Luke, but a series that takes stories and takes a look at stories from the Gospel of Luke. Our series entitled No Room, the Gospel for Outcasts and Ragamuffins. And this week, this morning, is probably one of the weirdest stories in the Gospels. It's one that I honestly don't know how often it gets preached. I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon on it. I know that I have never preached a sermon, which makes sense if I've never heard a sermon, right? I've never even preached it. It's a weird story, but I just kind of got to thinking, what better way to kick off Christmas week than by looking at a story about demon possession, right? Yeah! It's awesome. It's awesome. Bill's excited. It's depending on your background when it comes to demon possession. Depending on your background, it can be easy to forget that possession is a very real thing. The Bible doesn't look at it and say, it's kind of this weird thing that sits out there and we don't really talk about it. It's kind of easy to maybe sometimes to get into a place where you hear scientific explanations and medical explanations for all these different things. And after a while, you start to just kind of push it off to the side and be like, they used to call that demon possession. But the reality is it's just epilepsy. That's all it is, really. We know that now. It's easy to get caught up in that. But when the Bible talks about demon possession, the Bible's understanding and focus and lens is that this is a very real thing. And it's easy, depending on your background, depending on where you're from, to forget that it is a very real thing. But that then naturally raises questions and makes you wonder, and questions probably going through your head right now, of what exactly is demon possession? Because we don't, in our church tradition anyways, we don't talk about it a lot. We don't spend a lot of time with it. So what exactly is demon possession? What exactly does it mean to be demon possessed? It's a question that we really need to I need to spend a minute or two here on before we really dive into this, because it's such a big focus of the story and the text that we're looking at today. Demon possession, admittedly, is really hard to nail down. It's really hard to put a finger on it and say, this is what it is. There is so much that's written, so many different ideas, so many different opinions and takeaways and definitions and understandings and everything like that about what exactly this is, that it's really hard to nail it down. And one of the reasons that it's so hard to nail down, one of the reasons why there are so many different ideas and opinions about it, is because the Greek, and I'm going to go here, the Greek is in and of itself is pretty goosey, pretty iffy about the whole thing. The Greek word that is oftentimes translated as being demon-possessed is a word that has an enormously broad range of meanings that can mean everything from what we tend to think of as demon possession. If you're thinking about old movies like The Exorcist or something like that, it can include everything from that to something a bit more, benign, if we can call it that, when we're talking about demons, and say something more like demonized. Okay, it can cover the gamut, it can cover the gauntlet and go to a lot of different places. Realistically, the Greek word is probably best kind of literally translated as simply demonization or demonized. And maybe at its heart, the best that we can maybe really nail down is to say to be demon-possessed, when the Bible talks about that, really has in mind this idea that you or that something or someone has become the target of direct demon activity. Some things, and this is where it gets a little bit weird sometimes and hard to nail down, some things that we experience in life are simply the result of the ongoing effects of living in a world that is under the curse of sin. Some things happen simply because sin exists, and this world is still, God is still at work in the process of redeeming and restoring this world that we live in. Other things the Bible seems to suggest, the Bible points to other things we might say happen because of direct demon activity causing those things to happen. And one of the other challenging pieces of this is that something could happen and we might be inclined to say, well, that's demon activity, but in reality, it's really just the result of sin. And the exact same thing could happen in a different instance or another time, and that time might actually be demon activity. So the same thing, the same kind of thing that you're looking at could actually have two different causes. Not everything that Jesus encounters in the Gospels, all the healings, all the different things that he runs into, not everything that Jesus encounters in the Gospels is automatically attributed and called demon possession. If you look at that, there are times that Jesus runs into a person dealing with something, and it is just simply a result, or it's attributed to sin, or it's just simply a result of this is just the way that things happen for this person. Other times, Jesus can run into darn near the exact identical type of thing in a different person, and it's attributed to that person being demon possessed. So it seems almost inconsistent. You can't sit here and say, this happened, therefore this is demon activity, and that thing over there is something different and it's not demon activity. It depends on the situation. At this time, for myself, I don't know of any way, personally, I don't know of any way that we can possibly distinguish ordinary sin from demonization aside from revelation by the Holy Spirit. It'd be really easy for me. We would all want to sit here and say, well, how do I know? I just want to know. How can I look at a situation and know if this is a demon thing or if this is just a sin thing? And without the Holy Spirit coming along and God saying, this is what it is, we don't really know. We don't really know. I personally have never consciously encountered a demon. I'm inclined to say that some of you probably have experiences where maybe you've seen that. I personally have not. Not that I know of anyways, not consciously. The story that we're looking at today from Luke chapter 8 is a story of a man possessed by a demon and a story of Jesus leading somebody from death to life as a result or through the context of demon possession. Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8 is where we're going this morning. I'm going to start reading at verse 26. That's roughly about halfway through this chapter. Luke chapter 8, verse 26. And here's what we got. They, reference to Jesus and the disciples, they sailed to the region of the Gerasenes, which is across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house and had lived in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places. And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone inside of him. And they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. So some context, to kind of start off with some context. What's going on here? What's happening? What's the situation? So Jesus and his disciples, they had been in Galilee. That's where the stories that we've been looking at, that's where those stories had taken place, was in the town of Galilee, or the area, the region around Galilee. Jesus then, for whatever reason, decides it's time to get in a boat and go somewhere else. So they get in a boat and they go across what is sometimes known as the Sea of Galilee. Realistically, it's a lake. It's about 3 miles across. It's a bit like, I imagine it's a bit like being a Lake Tahoe. When you can sit on one side of the shore, the Galilee side of the shore, you can see the other side of the lake, and you can imagine his disciples at this point now, that's Peter, James, John, and he just added Levi or Matthew, as we saw last week. You can imagine that they had spent so many days sitting on their side of the lake and looking across at the other side and thinking to themselves, I will never go there. Because over there's a bunch of Gerasenes over there. And who are these guys? Who are these Gerasenes? Who are these people that Jesus was now going to? These people, they were Gentiles, as the Jews would refer to them as, but they were Gentiles who in many ways lived in a political no man's land. These were people who didn't belong to anybody. They were just sort of wild people who were sort of unorganized and unstructured, and just nobody really wanted them. Nobody wanted to interact with them. And so Jesus is now doing what most of us would never do, and he gets in a boat and he goes to the people that everybody around said, don't you ever go to them because they're crazy. Stay as far away from them as you can possibly get. Jesus gets in a boat and he goes. He's on, you almost kind of think about it, Jesus is going on a short-term mission trip. This is kind of a beautiful picture in many ways. This whole theme of this entire series has been about how Jesus steps and crosses lines and goes to the people and the places that nobody else wants to go to. And here's Jesus getting in a boat, and he's going to the people that nobody wants anything to do, not just Jews. Nobody wants anything to do with these people. And he goes over, and as soon as he steps out of the boat and steps onto the shore on the other side of the lake, as soon as he hits that, he gets hit with like the worst of the worst that the Gerasenes have to offer. All right, immediately he's confronted by this man who is not just simply demon possessed, he's demons possessed. He's got multiple demons inside of him taking over him. This is a man who it says, the text says, Luke says, this man has for a long time, he had not worn clothes. This man's running around naked. He doesn't live in a house. He lives in the tombs. He lives in verse 29, this demon had driven him into solitary places. This is a man who, for all intents and purposes, is no longer human. This man is living like an animal. It says at one point, the other Gerasenes, they actually put this guy multiple times. They would put this guy in chains and put him under guard, assign a guard to him, not in order to keep him safe, or not because he necessarily committed a crime, but in order to make sure that he didn't get anywhere close to anybody else. The Gerasenes are like, this guy is wacky. Stay away from him. He's bad news. And here he is falling at Jesus' feet. And Jesus doesn't recoil. He doesn't like, I'm out of here. I'm getting back in the boat and going to the other side. He doesn't do that. He's like, well, hold on a second. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk. What's your name? It's like he humanizes this man by asking his name. What's your name? And see, when this man comes, and when he falls in front of Jesus, what's kind of noteworthy is that the demons that are inside of him, they know who Jesus is. Now, Jesus has never been here before, that we know of anyways. Jesus has never been here before, but as soon as Jesus gets there, these demons, they come and says, verse 28, it says that this man with these demons speaking through him says, what do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I was reading a book this week about demons, or a part of a book that somebody wrote, and in that book, somebody wrote something about demons. And what the guy who wrote this book said, he pointed out that, oddly enough, when you see demons in the Bible, talked about in the Bible, demons almost have a higher Christology, a better, more mature, more developed sense of who Jesus is than a lot of believers do. Because it's pretty routine when demons show up and when Jesus encounters demons that the first thing they do is they acknowledge who Jesus is. They say, we know who you are. We know that you are the Son of God. We know that you are the Lord. We know what your power is. We know what your authority is. And I can't help but think, how often do we do that? How often are we so quick that the first thing that comes to our mind, the first thing that comes out of our mouth when we have an encounter with Jesus, when we come and we worship here or when we gather with other believers, how often is the first thing that comes out of our mouth is, Jesus is the Lord, the Son of the Most High. Almost every time that a demon shows up in Jesus' presence, that's the first thing out of their mouth. They know who Jesus is. They just refuse to work for him. They beg Jesus for mercy. It's something that's notable here. These demons, they beg Jesus for mercy. They say, Jesus, don't don't torture us. Whatever you do, don't torture us. Don't send us into the abyss. Because they recognize that when Jesus shows up, when Jesus comes on the scene, he is coming to bring life. And these demons, they are committed to bringing death. Think about this. The man that they possessed, he's not living in a house. He's not even living above ground. He's living in the tombs. He's living in the place where you put dead people. This man he's not acting in any way, shape, or form like a human being. These demons have stripped him of his humanness. They have pushed him not to live in the towns and around people and around places that bring life and that bring meaning to existence. They have pushed him out to solitary places. And now these demons are begging Jesus not to send them into the abyss, the place of death. Jesus is here to bring life, and they are here to work and to bring death. And so verse 32, a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and the demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. This is like, you kind of think, as I was reading this week and I was looking over this week, I'm thinking, then it's pretty clear Jesus ain't in Kansas anymore. Okay, that whole Wizard of Oz, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. Jesus ain't in Kansas because this is not just a herd of pigs that just happens to be kind of milling around on the hillside, sort of like wild pigs. This is a herd of pigs. These are pigs who have shepherds. I don't know what you call people who raise pigs. Those of you who are from Iowa probably have a better word for it than what I do. I don't know what's that? Rancher? There's a rancher, pig ranch, I don't know. But these pigs are being raised for food. Jews don't eat pork. They don't get anywhere close to pigs. They don't get anywhere even close to being in the vicinity because, see, if a Jew, according to Jewish law, if a Jew comes in contact with a pig, even just one pig or a dog, sorry for those of you who love dogs, and we have dogs, but even a dog, pigs are dogs, and you're not allowed to enter the temple. You're not allowed to worship God for at least a week if you come into contact. And now Jesus is in a land where they don't just simply tolerate wild pigs running around. They're actually raising them for food. And these demons who are here to bring life beg Jesus to go into these unclean animals. And then what do? They bring those animals to their death. More death. These demons keep pushing and keep working and keep bringing about death. And here's Jesus coming to bring life. It's just death upon death upon death in this story. Separation from God. And now here's Jesus. Here's Jesus. Verse 34. When those tending the pigs saw what had happened, they ran off and they reported this in the town and the countryside. And the people, they went out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man, this crazy guy, they found him from whom the demons had gone out, sitting at Jesus' feet. Sitting, not just, waving his arms and doing whatever he was doing, sitting at his feet, acting calm, dressed. They're used to seeing this guy naked. He's dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus, more like begged Jesus, asked Jesus to leave because they were overcome with fear. So he got into the boat and he left. I was struck by the fact that all of a sudden these people are afraid. They come out, they know who this guy is, they've locked him up in chains, they've put him under guard because they recognize that he's dangerous, that he's even a little bit too crazy and wacky even for them. And when they come and they see him, he's cured, he's acting normal, he's sitting calmly, he's dressed for a change, he's asking Jesus intelligent questions, he's listening, he's learning by all intents and purposes. He's probably acting more normal than what any of the rest of them were acting at this point. And it's at that point that they become afraid of this man. They're not afraid of him. See, at no point in Luke does it say they weren't afraid of him when they were locking him up in chains and he was breaking chains. They became afraid of him when all of a sudden they saw that this man has now been restored. That's when they become afraid of him. That's when they become, which just kind of makes you wonder, was this guy really the only one in the Gerasenes who was possessed by demons? Because remember how paranoid and how afraid the demons were when Jesus showed up? Maybe he wasn't the only one. Maybe this is an entire region. Maybe. I'm just kind of speculating here at this point. But they become afraid because all of a sudden they are looking at a guy who was once clearly dead and is now alive and restored, who has been given this new lease on life, so to speak. And so they beg Jesus to go. They beg him to leave. They say, we can't tolerate this. We can't be in your presence. You need to leave. You need to get out of here. So Jesus gets in the boat and he leaves. Verse 38. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him, begged to go with Jesus. But Jesus, and this might be kind of confusing for some of us, but Jesus sent him away, saying, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went away and told all over town how much Jesus had done for him. This man's life was completely transformed from death to life. He wasn't a man who, prior to meeting Jesus, he wasn't a man who was just simply living on the fringes, as we've been talking about. We've been talking about people who are on the fringes, who Jesus goes out and interacts with these people on the fringes. This wasn't a man who was just simply on the fringes and living on the fringes. This was a man who was on the fringes of the fringes of the fringes. He was way out there, and all of a sudden, here is Jesus. All of a sudden, Jesus came to him and restored him and made him whole. He was ready. When he had that experience, he was ready to drop everything and to spend the rest of his life following Jesus and with Jesus and in Jesus' presence. But Jesus instead turned him into one of the very first missionaries. He said, go back into town. Go back into town and tell your story. Tell the people around you, tell the people in this town, tell the people in your area, tell them what you have experienced, tell them what God has done for you, because you have a story. I just gave you a story. A story of moving from death to life, a story of moving from isolation and separation to inclusion and acceptance and worth and value. And these stories that we've been looking at, they often have multiple layers, and we have admittedly been taking a bit of an atypical approach, you might say, to looking at these stories. We've been looking at kind of the social dynamics of these stories, who's in, who's out, all that kind of stuff. The goal for us, as we've been looking at these stories, has been to see how Jesus yet again stepped across lines to make room for someone who generally does not belong in God's kingdom. Demons don't belong in God's kingdom, and yet here is the Messiah going to a man filled with demons and saying, here I am. I'm here for you. I'm going to fix you. I'm going to heal you. I'm going to make you worthy and acceptable to enter into God's kingdom. Jesus came and he gave hope. He gave peace. He gave joy to a man who had literally been stripped of his humanity. And it happened because Jesus came into this man's life and made room for him. Without Jesus taking that step, without Jesus getting in that boat, without Jesus coming to him, this man would still be dead. And Jesus gave him a story. He gave this man a story. And we all have a story. You've heard me say that a number of times, actually relatively recently now, where I've been talking about, and it's kind of been one of these things that's been coming out relatively frequently as we've been spending time in the Word together and the preaching and the teaching and all that we all have a story. The reality is that Jesus has given every single one of us a story to tell. And when it comes to thinking about evangelism and outreach and mission and sharing our faith and all this stuff, whatever term, whatever label you want to put on it, we can get wrapped up in programs and processes and techniques and all this stuff. But the most effective, the most powerful tool and gift that you have been given by God, that God has given you, the most effective evangelism strategy that any of us have, is our own stories. God has given you a story. You have been changed. You have a story to tell. So tell it. Tell it. Because without our personal connections to Jesus, without the birth, without things starting with the birth, every single person that we have looked at in Luke, every single person that we look at, every time we look at ourselves and look around ourselves, every time we look at ourselves in the mirror, every single person would have died believing that they were not acceptable, that they were not worthy of God's love, without the birth of the Son. My hope, my prayer has been that you might not have leprosy. I don't think anybody here has leprosy. You might not have leprosy. You might not be paralyzed. You might not be a tax collector. You might not be demon-possessed. That might not be you, but you still share. We all still share in the fact that each of these things that we have looked at so far, that each of these things was ultimately viewed as evidence that that person's sin was so great that God had actually barred them from entering his kingdom. That was the belief. But it's slavery to sin and alienation from God that ultimately prevents a person from entering God's presence. It's slavery to sin and alienation from God that ultimately prevents us from entering God's presence. Jesus was born. Jesus was born so that you could be brought into his kingdom. So that you would be fully restored to life, just like this man who was demon-possessed. And when the significance of that hits you, whenever it comes, when the significance that Jesus was born for you so that you would have life, when the significance of that truth hits you, when you begin to understand the room that Jesus has made room for you in his kingdom, when that hits you, go. Tell your story. Tell your story. Tell how much God has done for you.
A joyful all ye nations rise. Join the triumph of the skies. With angelic hosts proclaim Christ is born in Bethlehem.